Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our KEYS webinar. The topic for today is the inclusion imperative. So we will reflect together about how really understanding the diversity of the world around us may also mean that we need to change our traditional ways of working, and it may also mean that we need to face new challenges. We will start with Simon in the dimensions of public opinion by having a look at what people around the world are telling us based on their own experience. The following three speakers will each talk about one of the new challenges that we're facing. Trixie will address the challenge for researchers, as she's been studying how to strike the right balance between inclusion and representation. April from New York will join us to help us think about the challenge for brands and what organizations need to do to tune into the voices of underrepresented people. She will do this from the perspective of her home country, the US. Then we will move to Geeta in Bangalore, who will bring to life the challenge of complexity with the many different dynamics that we see when we work in India, which, as we all know, is one of the most diverse and most populous countries in the world. And with that, I will hand over to Simon.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today. And yes, I'm going to start by reflecting on what people around the world are telling us about how they feel. We're going to look at some of our regular monitors of public opinion, but also look at this through the lens of the new context in which we find ourselves, which already feels rather different to 4 or 8 weeks ago. Just to start, though, we'll think about our essentials survey. Now, this has been tracking how we feel and what we're doing since the start of the pandemic. And one of the key questions we've been following is a kind of self-assessment question. How are you feeling? Which best describes your current situation regarding the pandemic? And we've been watching people go forwards and backwards along this journey over this time. Now, the good news is, for the March data, looking across 16 countries, is that we are finding more and more people now starting to feel that they're putting the pandemic behind them. The March figures certainly better than February or indeed January. We're also finding fewer people concerned about new waves of infections and new variants. The marker we need to put down, however, is that it's still the large majority of us who are worried about those new waves of infections and new variants. And we only need to look at the news from Shanghai this week with the lockdowns there as a reminder of how unpredictable our journey is. Now, what our team have done is flag some different markers for different countries in terms of the latest data, and Canada and Spain are identified as ones which are just starting to get more into opening up mode, whereas UK, US and Australia are a little bit further down in terms of being more in a new normal situation, although it's still only the minority. Just to broaden that out a little bit, the What Worries the World study has been tracking the issues facing our countries around the world for a decade now. And the big highlight there is the rise of inflation as an issue. Barely registered this time last year, now it's up there in the top 5, and it's the number 1 in UK, US and Canada now. Second headline is the decline, at least for the moment, of coronavirus. This is the first time in 24 months it's been out of the top 5. It was 24 months ago that we had to rethink our questionnaire. It's a topic we're going to come back to later, because our questionnaire didn't include a rather important category to us now, which was pandemics, and 61% immediately, of course, mentioned coronavirus at that time. So many of us around the world were in real lockdowns. Now we're going to have to change our questionnaire instrument again now, because we did not have military conflict between nations in our survey, and that's something we are going to have to add in the wake of recent events in Ukraine. We're starting to track public opinion in different countries around the world, and you can look in at those on our websites. And beyond those very tragic events, we're of course all around the world trying to grapple with what this may mean for the world, what this may mean for our countries, and indeed for our daily lives. And the issues around energy are one of the topics which is now clearly front and centre, about where the supply is coming from and indeed how much it's going to cost us. We've got a new study out this week which paints, I think, quite an interesting picture of where people are right now on this topic. Certainly we're seeing concern about the impact of rising energy prices on our purchasing power, which we'll all need to be watching. It also shows that people are not attributing that to climate change. They are more likely to say it's about volatility in the markets or geopolitical tensions. And it's also the case that people are still telling us, at least for now, that it's really important that their country moves away from being overly dependent on fossil fuels. Now, as Jennifer mentioned in her introduction, we're really trying to get to grips with the dimensions of the world in all of its complexity and diversity in this session. And I've just drawn on a number of recent studies that also help us think through this topic. And I've left you with the links for you to go into more detail if you want to explore any of these after today's call. But just to start, I wanted to reflect on our International Women's Day study released earlier this month, and a couple of key findings really that I've drawn out just for this session. The first one, striking, alarming, but certainly one we need to grapple with. When it comes to giving women equal rights with men, things have gone far enough in my country. Well, across the surveys covered, the world is divided. 47% agree, 45% disagree. Now, of course, the big word here is in my country, or phrase is in my country, because there are huge differences in terms of when we're looking at the breakdowns there, when we have 12 countries with more than 50% saying things have gone far enough. And we get a similar pattern on this question about feminism. Feminism does more harm than good. 26% agree. Again, big differences by country. And those differences by country are often more pronounced than the differences we're finding by demographics within the country. Another one we thought was interesting to reflect on for our session today is this survey about interpersonal trust. And it really brings to light questions around language and how we interpret survey questions. Geeta's going to talk about this in a moment. But for now, I just wanted to share with you perhaps the headline finding from this study. 30% saying most people can be trusted. And it raises questions as we interpret what these questions mean around the phrase trust, about what it means in different languages and in different contexts. And certainly in the context of our own company, we're often debating this question about how do we define trust and what does it mean, and what does it mean in a particular environment. And we'll pick up on this in a little moment. The other study I wanted to flag just for the moment is around our Pride study that we do every year. It covers a number of different components, but the one I wanted to reflect on today are the questions around same-sex marriage. And here we've asked questions in a number of different ways. This one gives a self-assessment. We ask people to tell us how they think their views are different compared with 5 years ago. And I would say it's not something that's often asked in opinion research, and perhaps could be asked a little bit more often, just to help us to understand the nuances of where people's heads are. We find that 36% of people tell us that their views have changed over the last 5 years on this topic. And when we look at this topic in a more classic way, looking at the results from 2013 compared with the results now, we find that is corroborated. 12 out of 15 countries registering change in terms of support for same-sex marriage over that period. And for me, it just serves as a reminder for us to really give some thought to our questionnaire instruments, the questions we asked, how they're perceived by the respondents, and always be thinking that through before we put them into the field. So that ends my brief tour for today's session around the dimensions of public opinion. More you can delve into what we've been doing over the last month in our latest Ipsos update. But for the moment, I'll hand back to Jennifer in the studio in Milan.
Thanks, Simon. And you've really done an amazing job of reminding us of the multiple dimensions that we need to keep in mind when we think about inclusion and diversity. So quite a challenge for our industry, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. It really is. And we're really fortunate to have with us on the call today, Trixie, who's been looking for a number of years now about how we may need to rethink our approach and some of the techniques that we're using if we are to get closer to individuals in their own lives and are to build that more complex picture that is out there in the world today. So Trixie, we're really pleased to have you with us to share with us some of your experiences and your findings as you've been looking into this topic in more detail. So thank you so much for being with us.
Great, thanks, Simon. So hi, everybody. So yes, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the challenge for the researchers, as there are many, and we're still working out how best to deal with some of those. So in terms of inclusion and diversity, I'm struggling. Oh, there we go, next slide, perfect. There are many different aspects of diversity in the population. I've listed some of them here. There are many others, and some of them get more focus on them than others too. But we need to, as researchers, make sure that we learn to adapt our questions to make sure we're being culturally sensitive, and also that there are options for everybody and that we're respectful to everybody in the questions that we ask. I first got involved in this topic in 2016 when the UK Market Research Society decided to change their gender guidance to say that we should ask gender in a non-binary way. As a result of that, it became really clear there was a need for international guidance on how we could best ask gender in different countries in the world. And it became very clear that different countries were at different stages of acceptance of this topic. On the right-hand side, I just wanted to show you just a few of the non-binary identities that are now listed. As Simon mentioned, we recently ran a Pride study. This is the data from the 2021 study. And what we can clearly see when we look at gender identity by key generations, the younger generation, the Gen Z, really do have a more tendency to identify in a non-binary way. We see 4% are identifying as something other than male or female, with an additional 2% deciding that they would prefer not to answer the question. And this really starts to indicate that this topic is increasingly important, especially among our younger generations. So over the last few years, Black Lives Matter has really raised awareness and consciousness to the injustice around race and ethnicity. And as a result, there's been a lot more focus on being inclusive of all minorities and marginalised or underserved groups. So there are many challenges and considerations, and we don't have all the answers yet, but I wanted to talk through some of them with you. So starting with terminology, there's a lot of confusion around terminology. The language is always evolving, and we find that words that were used historically may not now be accepted in everyday language. We also find other terms are used interchangeably, which can cause confusion. For example, sex and gender. Most people's gender is the same as the sex that they were assigned at birth, but we're increasingly start to see that some people may identify with a different gender to their sex assigned at birth. And it's important to get that distinction. Race and ethnicity are also quite often interchanged. Race tends to be more based on biology, perhaps someone's skin colour or hair texture, with ethnicity being more about someone's ethnic background and cultural heritage. But when we look at this picture on the right-hand side, these black and white twin sisters, it maybe makes us rethink everything we know about race, but also maybe makes us question, what is the question we want to get an answer to? What should we be asking? We also need to make sure we use appropriate language. Inclusive language should always be used. We need to be careful not to exclude certain groups of the population unintentionally through the language that we use. We should be respectful and culturally sensitive with the language that we use. And we also need to make sure that we stay up to date with differing needs globally, but also recognizing local needs. Being representative and more inclusive is the goal, but it's not as easy as you might think. When we want to be representative, the first stage is to know what representation looks like, but there's limited census information on many aspects of diversity globally. For example, in Europe, it's very unusual to find race asked on a census. And globally, very few censuses ask sex or gender in a non-binary way. We also find some underserved communities may be less inclined to take part in research. This could be due to access. For example, for online surveys, they may not have the technology or maybe not the internet access. And also, there could be limitations for people in terms of their language or literacy abilities. We also find there is a cost consideration. Getting more representative samples and finding these underserved communities can be costly. There are also a number of international differences. Firstly, data privacy laws vary from country to country. But we also find differences in acceptance by country. For example, there are about 70 countries where same-sex relationships are still criminalized. So asking about sexual orientation, for example, could be very difficult for some respondents and potentially may not make them feel unsafe. So we need to adjust for these local nuances. We also need to bear in mind that some terms are not always easily understood or translatable in other languages. We also need to be careful about making assumptions about respondents. Interviewers need to ask questions rather than code based on what they believe they see. And questions should be asked to all that they might be relevant to. So for example, if we have a study about the menopause, we may need to be careful that we don't assume that only applies to people who have identified as female. And then we should balance inclusion and intrusion. Many of these aspects of diversity could be considered quite intrusive to ask about. And so we need to make sure that we're really considering what we're asking of who and how we ask those questions, and be mindful that these questions might not be considered acceptable by everybody. Moving forward, this is a really complex topic to get right at a global level. We need to have more discussion and collaboration and really understand what are the needs for research. We need improved engagement with underrepresented groups to ensure that their voices can be heard. And we need guidance on the language that we use, the questions and how we ask those questions, and insight into local nuances. Respondents are at the core of what we do. They all need to feel respected, engaged, and valued for who they are in the changing world around us. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Trixie, for giving us all this insight on all the things we need to be thinking about to make sure that we're addressing our respondents in the right way, and which is definitely a very, very big topic for us today as researchers. In one of your charts, you were talking specifically about the need to balance intrusion and inclusion. And I wonder if you could expand a little bit more on that, you know, from what you've seen and what you've been discussing with clients and researchers.
Yeah, of course. So many of the aspects of diversity are quite sensitive and for some people deeply personal. I talked about, you know, sexual orientation as an example, where in different countries around the world, it may be even criminalized to have a same-sex relationship. We need to be mindful that everybody has a different perception and comfort level with some of these topics. And we should consider whether we really want the information, do we need that information? And whether we can explain to respondents why we need it. If they feel it's intrusive, if we have a really good reason as to why we need that level of detail, they're much more likely to answer. And you know, we need to be mindful that different parts of a society will receive these questions quite differently. It might depend on people's lived experience, their beliefs, and also just the exposure they've had to some of these topics. And it'll vary across countries and cultural groups and also generations.
Great. So this idea of we need to have a good reason to ask certain questions is a very good thing to remember. Thanks a lot, Trixie. And so from the challenges for researchers, we're going to move to the challenges for brands, which in the end are behind all the research we do. And so very keen to hear from April on this topic. And we're going to fly to New York to do that. Over to you, April. I think you're still muted because we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great, thank you. So yes, let's talk about what does all this mean then for brands and for businesses. And I'd like to contend that it means a lot more than you may even realize. So I'm going to start with just asking you a question. What % of Americans would agree to this statement? Who would be more likely to consider a brand if its stance on equality aligned with my own, right? And the answer to that was more than what I thought. It's 60% of Americans, and as Trixie alluded to earlier, 70% of Gen Zers say that. So this new generation of people coming up have totally changed how they think about the role of businesses and brands, who they want to work for, who they want to work with, and what kind of products they want to buy. So we have a real role to play here, and it's not just a nice to have, it's actually expected, right? It's appropriate for any brand or industry to communicate their stance on equality issues. 57% of Americans say that. But of that 50%, 95% actually expect it, right? So it's not just I want it, but I expect it, and I will behave in accordance with how companies and brands have behaved as well. I think it's important then that as we note that companies are starting to think more about this, and what's interesting is I've been working on several projects where we realize that the world of work is really where so many of us, grow up a second time, right? It's where we need to start including other people for very specific reasons. Our products, our projects, the things we work on need to have a diverse perspective in terms of how people are going to be seeing what it is we provide to our people. So here are some of the things that I've been asked to work on and that have come up as projects for us. We've had one company ask us, how do I create a vision of an anti-racist world? A big question, but a very important one, and they realize that. Things like understanding these differences between countries and how it plays out. And then how about the affluent people in some of these underrepresented communities? They have money to spend. How do we make sure we're not offending them in any way? And then lastly, and very importantly, how do you do this in a way that's authentic and that demonstrates a real commitment that doesn't feel wrong or phony or insensitive? So I'm going to offer a way to think about that. So here is our wheel of power and privilege. It was done by Sylvia Duckworth. She is a person who's kind of mapped this out in a way that I found very interesting. So at the center of this wheel, we have power, right? And this is where the power resides. If you speak English, somehow that's more powerful in the US than a non-English person. If you are heterosexual, that's more powerful than being gay or lesbian. If you're white, that's more powerful than being dark. And if you're a man, it is more powerful than being a woman. And a cisgender woman is more powerful than being trans or non-binary. This is just how it seems to have landed, right? And the question is, how do we as brands and businesses start to do something with this? So I'm going to quote my mom here. She used to always tell me, April, you got to pick your war, and then you have to pick your weapon, right? So I'm going to offer that to you as you think through this wheel of power and privilege. Let's think about what the root is. What's the cause of this power basis that we seem to have created? How does it play out? And then what are you going to do about it? How are you going to pick the weapon to help with that? So I would contend that it starts usually with a lie, right? Women are not as smart as men. Black people are less than white people. It's a lie at its core. And you have to understand and recognize that lie and admit to it. And once you've done that, let's see how that lie plays out. There's things that are done systemically, very consciously, right? There's things that are done systemically in a very unconscious way. And then there's things that we do as individuals, unconsciously for sure, but some are conscious and we need to address those. And how you address them will be different as you go around this quadrant, right? So let's take an example. I'm going to talk about mortgage practices in the US, where the lie started with Black and brown people are less than white people. That's the lie, that's where we begin. How that started to play out when it came to mortgages was there were unfair policies and laws where that inequality was enforced. So people were forced to live in certain places. They were and people were forced to not sell their homes to other people. So it was a forced segregation that happened. If you're looking at something that is done very consciously and is part of the system now, I would suggest as companies, we need to start looking at actually influencing those policies. And we all know that can be done from a level of a corporation. Let's think about something that's systemic but more unconscious, right? Think about your organizations. I don't think anyone has gone into an organization saying, we are not going to have diversity in our organization and we're not going to have it at every level. But I would venture to say that many of our organizations actually do not have diversity at every level. There are 4 Black CEOs right now in the Fortune 500, 4 out of 500. So some of this is unconscious. Don't think that was done consciously, but it is there and it is systemic at this point. When you look at things that are systemic like that, you need to start actually talking about what you want your organizations to look like, come up with those initiatives to hire more people, to promote more people so that you can create the organization you want, and then measure that just like you would any other strategic initiative in your company. Let's talk about individuals now. All of us, I will say, have some kind of bias going on. It's just part of who we are as humans. And sometimes that is very unconscious, right? But let's think about what that does. Those kind of unconscious biases create negative stereotypes and fear-based narratives that we start living by, not necessarily on purpose, but it happens, right? So if that's the case, we need to start educating each other. We need to start knowing each other, and we need to start really interacting so that we know someone's story, and that makes all the difference in the world. And then lastly, there's this area of very conscious individual behavior where that lie is believed, and that's where you start getting into supremacist behaviors and thoughts. And I put a big question mark here because I don't know how to change a heart in that way, but I would argue that if you really pay attention to those other 3 quadrants, that this one will start to shrink, and then we can cut it out just like a cancer. So how do you do that? How do you maintain some level of authenticity? Well, I would say you start with your origin story. Where did it all begin? Our companies have very vast and lofty purposes and mission statements. That's great. Let's start there and see what it is you want to be. What kind of legacy do you want to leave? And then take an honest assessment of who you love and who loves you and who hates you. Right? And I think if you do that honestly, you'll be able to really talk authentically about the war that you've chosen to pick and the weapon you use. So what does it look like when you're inclusive? At a very base level, it's about representation. Let's make sure we have all people in that whatever commercial it is, whatever it is. I mean, I think advertising makes it very easy to illustrate this. So now we've put diverse people in the ad. But once you start moving up the ladder, now it's a question of what are they doing? Is it in authentic situations that they can relate to? So in this case, we had a Hispanic family and we realized that they really bring their mothers, their elders to see where it is they're going to live, because chances are they may be living with them eventually. So note the authenticity of the situation. Then move on to insights. is this built on strategies that are driven by insights into the community? And once you can do that, then that community will recognize that you know who they are. And lastly, at the top of this ladder is about advocacy. Once you know that and you've developed the insights, how do you truly advocate for the people that you're trying to represent? Trixie talks about this a bit, but this idea of every country being different, it's because they all have a unique history. And we came to these realities of power and privilege in very different ways. So I love this quote where a lawyer from one of our studies said, there's several things that make our racism in Brazil very specific, right? It's no less brutal, it's no less cruel, but it's specific to being a Brazilian in that context. And here's a suggested approach. I would argue as you start to go through this, always frame the challenge so that you talk to people and understand what the real need is, what's the real question. Talk with experts who can give you that history that you're understanding, that you need to understand. Understand the broad needs. So I would recommend, going in and talking to people and letting them talk to each other so that you can hear some of the issues that rise to the surface, and then immerse in their lives, really be a part of what it is that they're going through at any point in time. And from there, you can really do what we do best as business people, activate that and amplify it, develop playbooks as to how you're going to change the initiative that you've decided to go after. So I leave you with that. The one thing I would like to just have you think about, that equality is not the same as equity, that once some of those power plays have happened, then people are already at a disadvantage. And so to just make things equal, they still can't see the game, right? But so those people may need a little boost. They may need some extra height in order to be able to be equal in terms of how they can observe and play what's going on. So that's all I have to say, Jennifer. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks a lot. Yes, it is, definitely. Thank you very much for that perspective. Just a quick question to wrap up, April. You were mentioning your mum, and I was wondering as I was listening to you, is what was important for your mum then still the same or different from what is important for your kids today? How does generation play in this whole aspect?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think, if you think about it, things have changed for sure from when my mother was growing up, from where my kids are, but here's what's the same. All those things I talked about, for example, the mortgage things that were happening, we couldn't live in certain areas, that impacts wealth as generations move down. So if you were able to buy a home in the 1950s, that wealth you could pass down to your children. My parents were not able to do that. So some of those things are still hanging around, right? And we have to figure out how to address that as companies and as Gen Zers start to really make decisions based on those things that we do.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot for that extra little piece of perspective. And we're going to continue with this idea of looking at the specifics of countries and what locally really matters and makes a difference with Geeta, who's going to tell us about the challenge that we face in the very diverse country where she lives. So over to you, Geeta, to talk about India.
Thanks, Jennifer. I was listening intently to April. Very inspiring. Pick your war and pick your weapon. And indeed, you spoke of the need for brands to represent all voices equally. When you think of a country like India, a vast and diverse market, that challenge really comes to life. So first of all, I think some of the facts that most of us know is the population of India. In a few years, we will be the most populous country in the world. And of course, the huge diversity that exists, the sheer difference in terms of income. For instance, India has the largest number of billionaires only after US and China. And it also happens to have a very large population, almost as large as that of the United States, living in desperate poverty. So there is a huge amount of diversity, and it may seem like that is what leads to complexity. But I want to argue that it's not the variation that leads to complexity, because statistics can handle variation. it is in fact the interconnectedness between factors that leads to complexity. And I just want to talk a little bit about this by picking on three aspects. One is geography, the second is languages spoken in India, and the third being the level of education. And if you think about it, the vastness of India, compounded by the fact that pretty much most of data is still collected face-to-face, be it in large metropolises like Delhi or Mumbai, or far-flung villages in the Northeast. So data is still being collected face-to-face for a large part of it. And this means data collection sometimes seems like an adventure, going to places where sometimes there is not even a road. And these are pictures taken from a recent survey that we did. So this is what really fieldwork sometimes looks like. But that's geography in one sense of the word. But geography also means that there is variation in agroclimatic condition. And now that has a very profound effect on how people live. I'll just talk about this by making you consider a simple question. And this has been taken from a European survey among teenagers. Where and with whom did you have breakfast yesterday? A simple question. But immediately we begin to realize that asking such a question in a diverse market like India means that you have to account for many, many, many response options. The kind of the variety of dishes that may pop up will be mind-boggling. But really, there is something more, because the very fact that there are people living in different agroclimatic conditions, and that factor interacting with factors such as occupation or economic status means that there are huge variations in meal patterns right across India. And that really means that if you think of a word like breakfast, does it really have a unique and a distinct meaning for all the people that we're going to speak to? These are the kind of considerations that one has to reflect on when one mounts a survey in the context of so much variation. And therefore, the first lesson I want to call out is that we always need to examine if some of the contextual realities that are built into the investigation, are they really truly universal? Will it mean the same thing to everybody? The second aspect is the many languages that India speaks in. And if you think about it, many people sometimes tell us, well, India is like, the whole continent of Europe within it, but not quite, because the 24 languages in Europe are written in 2 distinct scripts. But the 22 official languages in India, and India has hundreds of languages, are written in as many as 14 distinct scripts, some of which you see on the screen. And this leads to a lot of sort of complication when it comes to rendering questionnaires or stimulus across for a fairly large study. But the impact of languages is indeed beyond this. Because if you think about it, languages embody cultures, and within languages live the beliefs, values, sort of mythology of different societies. And if you were to do a motivational study, and there are all these concepts such as power and belonging or conviviality, how do you even begin to translate some of these into various languages in a way that it resonates and conveys the same meaning across cultures? So the impact of language is indeed profound. And when you work in a multilingual context such as India, you learn to think vernacular first. So most of us researchers are told time and time again, think in any Indian language that you're comfortable in, and then write your questionnaire, then write your focus group guide, whatever that may be. Because it's always easier to translate from proximate cultures than to use like a central language from which all other translations could emanate. And this lesson would easily sort of benefit anybody who is trying to do a multilingual study in any sort of a context. The third aspect, which I wanted to touch upon briefly, is education. And I think Trixie spoke about it earlier as well, about education limiting the way people can respond, right? So that is one aspect of it. Self-administered inquiry, which is typically how investigations are done world over, is often not possible in India because of lower levels of literacy. And when you have more complex studies where, for instance, you have to record a diary of behavior, you then deploy some innovative solutions like using school kids from the neighborhood or from within the family as surrogate data collectors. But like everything else, education also has a deeper impact, because education in a way affects how you use technology, it affects access to technology, and therefore when you think about different modes of gathering data, different modes of data collection, you are aware that not all modes are accessing all parts of the population. Trixie did speak of this earlier when she mentioned that we need to be mindful of how a particular mode may be reaching or leaving out parts of population. And that's indeed the reality, because if you think about it, online surveys may be a great way to reach out to tech-savvy youth. But is this the right mode for, let's say, reaching out to petty traders in small town India? Not perhaps. On the other extreme, you have face-to-face data collection, which kind of works brilliantly if you were to include rural households. But at the same breath, you cannot always use it to access the more affluent, the HNI individuals living in metros. So when you mount a study in India, you're constantly aware that in order to represent the full spectrum of the population, you need to resort to even multiple modes of data collection. And therefore, typically, complete representation often means using hybrid modes of data collection. These are some of the living constant challenges that one deals with when one is trying to represent the voice of a complex, large population such as India. But at the same time, this experience also sort of builds in a degree of humility. It makes you realize that, understanding the world around us in all its complexity and diversity is really about enabling people to fully express their lived truths. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Geeta, for bringing this to life for us so vividly. And I was wondering if, to wrap up, you had maybe just one final recommendation for anyone on the call that wants to do work in India. What would you say? What would you advise?
That's interesting, Jennifer. Whether it's India or any other such diverse, complex market, I think the simplest approach would be to immerse yourself in the subject, in the context that you want to understand. Because when you're in real life, in that situation, you begin to appreciate things from a completely different perspective. And that added perspective makes you examine assumptions, makes you correct things, and actually brings a little more authenticity to what you're trying to study and what you're trying to bring out. That's how I would, I guess, approach it.
Great, thank you so much. And there's been a lot about immersing oneself in the reality across all of the presentations. There is a common thread there. So thank you very, very much to all of you. A huge topic. We were able to give a bit of a whistle-stop tour on many aspects. And I would like to thank all the speakers, but also all of you who were able to be with us today. Very happy to have you. And we do hope to see you again in 1 month's time for our next Keys webinar. Bye-bye now.